January 17, 1940. A yellow biplane schemes across a frozen Texas cotton field, its wings stained with pesticide. The pilot, a crop duster named Eugene Fletcher, has 3,000 hours of flight time, all of it chasing grasshoppers and boll weevils 500 feet off the ground. He doesn't know that in 18 months, he'll be flying a B-17 Flying Fortress over Nazi Germany. In 1940, America had fewer than 2,000 trained military pilots. Then France fell, Britain burned, and suddenly, the U.S. needed 100,000 combat pilots, fast. The military did something unprecedented. They went looking for men who already knew how to fly. Not officers, not academy graduates, crop dusters, barnstormers, mail carriers, bush pilots, men who flew alone, by instinct, who knew machines like their own hands. The Army gave them 6 months to transform from solo civilian flyers into bomber commanders leading formations of 36 aircraft through flak and fire. And it worked. By 1943, German pilots couldn't understand what they were facing, American bomber formations so disciplined, so unshakable, they flew like machines. Where had these pilots come from? They came from cotton fields, from county airstrips, from the unforgiving school of commercial flying, where mistakes meant bankruptcy or death. This is the story of how America turned crop dusters into the most devastating air force the world had ever seen, in just 6 months. America had no trained pilots in 1940, so crop dusters became bomber commanders in 6 months. January 17, 1940. Dawn breaks cold and pale over a cotton field outside Lubbock, Texas. The air smells of diesel fuel and fertilizer. A single-engine Stearman biplane, yellow wings streaked with chemical residue, putters low across dormant rows, its engine coughing in the frozen morning. The pilot, a man named Eugene Fletcher, 26 years old, leans out of the open cockpit, squinting against the wind. His gloves are stained with pesticide. His logbook records 3,000 hours of flight time, all of it within 500 feet of the ground, all of it alone, all of it chasing grasshoppers and boll weevils across the Texas Panhandle. He does not know that in 18 months, he will be flying a B-17 Flying Fortress over the North Sea, leading a formation of 36 bombers through flak and fire, responsible for 360 lives. He does not know that the United States Army Air Corps, desperate, undermanned, and facing the largest industrial war in human history, will come looking for men like him. Men who can fly by instinct. Men who know machines. Men who are not afraid of the sky. The biplane dips low, schemes the earth, pulls up sharply at the fence line. Fletcher banks hard left, throttle wide open, feeling the G-force press him into the seat. This is not sport. This is work. Dangerous, underpaid, unglamorous work. But it is flight. And flight, in 1940, is still a rare and precious skill. He does not know that this skill, this intimacy with altitude and engine temperament, with wind shear and dead stick landings, will become, in the hands of the American military, one of the most devastating weapons of the Second World War. In the winter of 1940, the United States Army Air Corps possessed fewer than 2,000 trained pilots. The entire officer corps of American military aviation could fit inside a single high school gymnasium. The aircraft inventory was obsolete, biplanes left over from the Great War, trainers with fabric wings, bombers so slow they could barely outrun a speedboat. The doctrine was outdated. The infrastructure was non-existent. There were no bomber schools, no navigation academies, no gunnery ranges. The Air Corps had been starved of funding for 2 decades, gutted by isolationism and the Great Depression, reduced to a skeletal force that existed more on paper than in the sky. And then the war came. Not to America, not yet, but to Europe. In September 1939, Nazi Germany invaded Poland. Within weeks, the Luftwaffe had demonstrated a new kind of warfare, fast, brutal, coordinated. Dive bombers screamed out of the clouds. Fighters strafed refugee columns. The skies over Warsaw turned black with smoke. By the spring of 1940, France had fallen. Britain stood alone, battered by nightly bombing raids, its cities burning, its airfields cratered, its fighter pilots flying 3 sorties a day until they collapsed from exhaustion. In Washington, the realization struck like a thunderclap: America was not ready. Not for this. Not for industrial air war on a scale that consumed nations. President Franklin Roosevelt called for an expansion of the Air Corps to 50,000 pilots. Then 100,000. The numbers were staggering. Impossible. To train that many pilots in the conventional way, through the military academy pipeline, through officer candidate school, through years of slow, methodical instruction. Would take a decade. The war would be over. The world would be lost. So the Air Corps did something unprecedented, something born of desperation and American pragmatism. They went looking for men who already knew how to fly. Not military men. Not academy graduates. Not officers. Crop dusters. Stunt pilots. Mail carriers. Barnstormers. Bush pilots. Men who flew for a living in the civilian world, far from the parade grounds and the spit-shine discipline of military tradition. Men who had learned to fly not in formation, not by the book, but alone, improvising, surviving. The military opened the gates. In the spring of 1940, recruiting officers fanned out across rural America, placing advertisements in farm journals and aviation magazines, setting up tents at county airstrips and crop dusting outfits. The message was simple: if you can fly, we need you. Now. Eugene Fletcher read the advertisement in a feed store in Amarillo. He folded the paper, walked out to his biplane, and flew east. The men who arrived at the newly established flight training schools in the summer of 1940 were unlike anything the military had ever seen. They were older than the typical cadet, many in their late 20s or 30s. They were rough-edged, sunburned, laconic. They had calluses on their hands and grease under their fingernails. They did not salute crisply. They did not march in step. They did not come from Ivy League universities or wealthy families. They came from dirt farms and oil fields and logging camps. They had names like Fletcher and Macaulay and Ridgway. They spoke in drawls and twangs. They chewed tobacco and rolled their own cigarettes. They looked, to the spit-polished officers of the peacetime Air Corps, like a rabble. But they could fly. The military quickly discovered that these men possessed an operational fluency that could not be taught in a classroom. They understood airplanes as living, temperamental machines. They knew the sound of an engine losing compression. They could feel a crosswind in their bones. They had flown in thunderstorms and ice storms and dust storms. They had landed on dirt roads and cow pastures. They had nursed dying engines back to base on instinct and prayer. They had learned, through hard experience, the margin between safety and disaster, and they had learned to operate comfortably within that margin. The Air Corps training program, hastily expanded and re-engineered for mass production, built on that foundation. The curriculum was compressed, streamlined, ruthlessly efficient. Ground school covered navigation, meteorology, aircraft systems, but the emphasis was always on flight time. Hours in the cockpit, hours in formation, hours learning to fly not as individuals but as units, as flights, as squadrons. Hours learning the new aircraft, the B-17 Flying Fortress, the B-24 Liberator, the B-25 Mitchell. Heavy bombers, multi-engine giants that required not just piloting skill but crew coordination, instrument proficiency, and an entirely new way of thinking about flight. Eugene Fletcher, accustomed to flying alone in a tiny biplane, found himself at the controls of a 4-engine bomber weighing 30 tons. The B-17 had a crew of 10 men. It carried 13 machine guns and 4,000 pounds of bombs. It cruised at 25,000 feet, in air so thin and cold that oxygen was mandatory and frostbite was a constant threat. It flew in formations of dozens or hundreds of aircraft, stacked in tight boxes where the wingtip of one bomber passed within feet of the tail of another. A single mistake, a moment of inattention, a miscalculation of altitude or airspeed, could cause a mid-air collision, a fireball, 300 men dead in an instant. Fletcher learned. They all learned. The military gave them 6 months. By the summer of 1941, men who had been crop dusters 18 months earlier were instructors themselves, teaching the next wave. By 1942, they were bomber commanders, leading missions over North Africa and the Pacific. By 1943, they were flying into the heart of Nazi Germany, into flak so thick it looked like storm clouds, into fighter attacks so savage that entire formations could be torn apart in minutes. They did not expect this. None of them expected this. What the German Luftwaffe pilots saw in the skies over occupied Europe, beginning in the autumn of 1942, was something they had not anticipated. They had fought the Royal Air Force and the Soviet Air Force. They had faced British Spitfires and Russian Yaks. They were veterans, many of them, with hundreds of combat missions, with kill counts painted on their fuselages in neat rows. They understood air combat. They understood their enemy. But the Americans were different. The formations were impossibly tight. The bombers flew in staggered boxes, each aircraft covering the blind spots of the others, interlocking fields of fire from 50 caliber machine guns creating a wall of steel. The discipline was mechanical, unshakable. When a bomber was hit, engine smoking, wings shredded, the formation did not break. The damaged aircraft fell away, and the others closed the gap, maintaining speed, maintaining altitude, pressing on toward the target. The Luftwaffe pilots attacked from every angle, head-on passes at closing speeds of 500 miles per hour, diving attacks from above, beam attacks from the flanks. The American bombers absorbed punishment that should have destroyed them. Engines shot out, tail sections blown off, fuselages riddled with cannon fire, and still they flew. In the debriefing rooms of Luftwaffe airfields, German pilots struggled to explain what they were seeing. These American crews, where had they come from? How had the United States, a nation with no air force to speak of 2 years earlier, produced thousands of pilots capable of flying these missions? How had they learned formation discipline so quickly? How had they learned to operate under such conditions, freezing cold, oxygen deprivation, constant fear, and still hit their targets? The Germans expected conscripts, green recruits, farm boys and factory workers thrown into cockpits after a few weeks of training. What they found were men who flew like veterans, men who handled damaged aircraft with eerie calm, men who brought crippled bombers home on 2 engines, or 1 engine, or no engines, gliding dead-stick into emergency fields, saving their crews through sheer skill and stubborn refusal to quit. The Luftwaffe did not know that many of these pilots had been flying for a decade before the war started. They did not know about the crop dusters and the barnstormers and the mail carriers. They did not know that the United States had built its air force not from scratch, but from a reservoir of civilian aviators, men who had learned to fly in the hardest school of all, the unforgiving school of commercial necessity, where mistakes meant bankruptcy or death, where there were no second chances, where survival depended on skill and judgment and an intimate understanding of flight. The Germans expected an industrial army. What they faced was something stranger, an industrial democracy that had turned its civilian expertise into military power almost overnight. The statistics are staggering. Between 1940 and 1945, the United States trained more than 200,000 pilots. The Army Air Forces grew from fewer than 2,000 pilots to the largest air force in the world. At its peak, American aircraft production exceeded 90,000 planes per year, more than Germany and Japan combined. The training infrastructure expanded to include hundreds of airfields, thousands of instructors, millions of flight hours. The pipeline ran 24 hours a day, turning out bomber crews and fighter pilots and transport pilots and reconnaissance pilots at a rate that no other nation could match. But numbers alone do not explain what happened. The Soviet Union had numbers. Germany had numbers. Japan had numbers. What America had was something different. A culture of aviation that existed outside the military, a civilian tradition of flying that stretched back to the barnstorming days of the 1920s, to the air-mail routes of the 1930s, to the crop dusters and bush pilots and weekend flyers who had made aviation not a military monopoly but a civilian industry. When the war came, that industry became a weapon. The crop dusters brought with them a mentality forged in the hardscrabble economics of agricultural flying. They understood risk management. They understood machine maintenance. They understood weather. They understood the difference between courage and stupidity. They had flown low-altitude missions every day of their working lives, missions where a moment of inattention meant a crash, where mechanical failure meant death, where survival depended on constant vigilance and split-second decision-making. The military took that mentality and scaled it up, gave it bombers instead of biplanes, gave it formation tactics instead of solo flight, gave it a mission: destroy the industrial capacity of the Axis powers, cripple their factories, burn their oil refineries, shatter their rail networks, bomb them into submission. The crop dusters became bomber commanders, and they were devastating. There is a photograph, taken in the spring of 1943, at an airbase in England. It shows a B-17 crew standing in front of their aircraft. 10 men, young faces, leather jackets, fleece-lined boots. The pilot is a man named Eugene Fletcher. He is 29 years old. He has flown 32 combat missions over Germany and occupied France. His aircraft, a B-17F named Cotton Queen, bears the scars of those missions: patches over flak holes, a replaced engine cowling, a tail section repaired 3 times. The nose art shows a cartoon biplane dusting a field. Fletcher's co-pilot is a former flight instructor from Kansas. His navigator is a mathematics teacher from Ohio. His bombardier is a college dropout from Pennsylvania. His flight engineer is a mechanic who once worked on combine harvesters in Iowa. His radio operator is a telegraph clerk from Missouri. His gunners are farm boys and factory workers and gas station attendants. They are, by any conventional measure, an unlikely crew. None of them are professional soldiers. None of them come from military families. None of them imagined, 5 years earlier, that they would be flying into the most dangerous skies in the world, dropping high explosives on industrial targets deep inside Nazi Germany. But they are good at what they do. They are very good. Fletcher flies with the same steady, unhurried competence he brought to crop dusting. He does not panic. He does not showboat. He flies the aircraft as if it were a tool, a big, complicated, dangerous tool, and his job is to use it correctly. When the flak bursts around him, shrapnel tearing through the wings, he holds the formation. When the fighters come diving out of the sun, he maintains altitude and airspeed, trusting his gunners, trusting the formation, trusting the plan. When the target appears below, a factory complex, a rail yard, a U-boat pen, he flies straight and level through the flak, giving his bombardier the steady platform he needs to aim, to calculate, to release. The bombs fall. The target erupts in smoke and flame. The B-17s turn for home. On the flight back, with one engine feathered and fuel running low, Fletcher brings Cotton Queen down at an emergency airstrip on the English coast. The landing is smooth, professional, unremarkable. The crew climbs out, counts the flak holes, 47 this time, and walks to the debriefing room. Fletcher lights a cigarette, fills out the mission report, and goes to sleep. In 6 days, he will do it again. The German and Japanese military establishments struggled to understand this phenomenon. Their own air forces were built on rigid hierarchies, on aristocratic traditions, on the cult of the fighter ace. Pilots were officers, often from upper-class families, trained from adolescence in military schools, steeped in codes of honor and notions of aerial chivalry. The idea that a peasant, a laborer, a crop duster could be entrusted with a heavy bomber and sent to wage industrial warfare was alien to their thinking. But the Americans did not care about tradition. They cared about results. The crop dusters delivered results. They flew their missions with a blue-collar pragmatism that was uniquely American. They did not romanticize war. They did not see themselves as knights of the sky. They saw themselves as workers with a job to do. A dangerous, exhausting, terrifying job, but a job nonetheless. They approached it with the same grim determination they had brought to flying pesticide runs over cotton fields. Show up, do the work, survive, come back tomorrow. This mentality permeated the American Air War. The bomber crews flew in daylight, in clear weather, so they could aim precisely, so they could hit factories and rail yards and oil refineries with accuracy. The British flew at night, dropping bombs on cities, accepting collateral damage as inevitable. The Americans flew during the day, into the teeth of the defenses, accepting higher casualties because they believed, correctly, that precision bombing would win the war faster. It was a brutal calculus. The loss rates were staggering. On some missions, 10% of the bombers did not return. 20%, 30%. The life expectancy of a bomber crew in 1943 was 15 missions. The required tour of duty was 25 missions. The math was simple and terrifying. Statistically, you would not survive. But they kept flying. The crop dusters and the instructors and the college kids and the factory workers. They kept showing up, kept climbing into the bombers, kept flying into Germany, kept dropping their bombs, kept coming home, or not coming home. And the replacements kept arriving, fresh crews with new faces, and the missions kept launching, day after day, week after week, month after month, an industrial process of destruction on a scale the world had never seen. The Axis powers could not match it. They did not have the pilots. They did not have the industrial base. They did not have the training infrastructure. They did not have the civilian aviation culture to draw on. The Americans had all of it, and they used it. There is a recurring image in the memoirs of German soldiers stationed in occupied Europe during the final years of the war, the sky filled with bombers. Hundreds of them, thousands of them, flying in formations so large they stretched from horizon to horizon, the condensation trails of their engines weaving white lines across the blue, the sound of their engines a low, droning roar that went on for hours. The soldiers, looking up, would feel a kind of numb despair. This was not warfare as they understood it. This was something else. This was the output of a system they could not fight, could not stop, could not even comprehend. One German officer, writing in his diary in the autumn of 1944, described watching an American bomber stream pass overhead on its way to Berlin. He counted 250 aircraft. He noted the tight formations, the unwavering course, the absence of panic or disorder. He wrote, "They fly like machines, not like men. Like machines built by other machines, all identical, all perfect, all unstoppable." He did not know that some of those pilots had been crop dusters 3 years earlier. He did not know that they were men who had learned to fly alone, in the wind, chasing insects across empty fields. He did not know that America had taken that humble, practical skill and transformed it into the instrument of his nation's destruction. But he understood, watching the bombers pass, that he was witnessing the power of a democracy at war. A democracy that could mobilize its civilians, its industry, its farmland, its entire society and turn it into a weapon. A democracy that did not need a warrior caste or a military aristocracy because it had something more powerful, ordinary men with extraordinary skills, willing to fight, willing to die, because they believed, however hazily, however inarticulately, in the cause. The bombers flew on. The factories burned. The war continued. By the spring of 1945, the Luftwaffe was finished. Its airfields were overrun. Its fuel supplies were exhausted. Its pilots were dead or captured or flying obsolete aircraft against impossible odds. The skies over Germany belonged to the Americans and the British. The bomber streams flew unopposed, hitting targets at will, reducing cities to rubble, destroying what remained of the Third Reich's industrial capacity. In the Pacific, the same process unfolded. American bombers, many of them flown by the same crop dusters and barnstormers, transferred from Europe after Germany's surrender, ranged across the Japanese home islands, burning cities, mining harbors, severing supply lines. The Japanese Air Force, once formidable, was reduced to kamikaze attacks, suicide missions flown by teenagers in obsolete planes. The Americans flew in perfect formations, dropping incendiary bombs, napalm, and finally, in August 1945, atomic weapons. The war ended. The bombers came home. The crews dispersed, returning to the lives they had left behind, or trying to. Some went back to crop dusting. Some became airline pilots. Some bought farms or opened businesses or went to college on the GI Bill. Some never spoke about the war. Some could not stop speaking about it. Eugene Fletcher returned to Texas in the autumn of 1945. He bought a new Stearman, repainted yellow, and went back to dusting cotton fields. He flew low, as he always had, skimming the earth, feeling the wind. He did not talk much about the war. When people asked, he would say it was a job, and he did it, and now it was over. But sometimes, on a clear day, when the sky was very blue and very empty, he would climb to altitude, 5,000 feet, 10,000 feet, and fly straight and level, alone, the engine humming, the horizon wide. And he would remember the formations, the tight boxes of bombers, the men he flew with, the missions they flew, the things they saw and did and survived. And he would think about the strange, improbable fact of it, that America, a nation with no trained pilots in 1940, had built the largest air force in the world in 5 years. That it had done so not by drafting aristocrats or training warriors from childhood, but by finding men who could already fly, humble men, working men, men who flew crop dusters and mail planes, and giving them bombers and asking them to win a war. And they had. In the end, the story of the crop dusters who became bomber commanders is a story about the nature of American power in the 20th century. It is not a story of military tradition or martial culture or warrior elites. It is a story of industrial scale, of civilian expertise repurposed for war, of democracy's ability to mobilize its entire society when necessary. It is a story of ordinary men doing extraordinary things, not because they were born to it, not because they were trained for it from childhood, but because the circumstances demanded it and they were willing to try. The biplane and the bomber, two machines, separated by a vast gulf of technology and purpose, yet connected by a single thread. The skill of flight, the knowledge of the sky, the intimacy with machines that allowed one generation of pilots to become another. The Germans and the Japanese built their air forces around aces, around heroes, around men who embodied national ideals of courage and sacrifice. The Americans built their air force around workers, men who clocked in, did the job, clocked out, men who saw war as labor, dangerous and necessary, but labor nonetheless. It was the workers who won. The crop dusters who became bomber commanders did not think of themselves as heroes. They did not seek glory or honor or fame. They flew their missions, dropped their bombs, brought their crews home, and when it was over, they went back to their lives. They did not need monuments or parades. They had done what needed to be done. But their legacy is visible in every subsequent generation of American airpower. In the fighter pilots and astronauts and test pilots who followed them. In the civilian aviation industry that exploded after the war, built on the infrastructure and training systems developed during the conflict. In the culture of American aviation itself, which remains, to this day, less a military monopoly than a civilian tradition, a tradition of flight rooted not in aristocracy or hierarchy, but in the democratic idea that anyone, with skill and will and opportunity, can take to the sky. The biplane in the cotton field, the bomber over Berlin, both flown by the same kind of man, both symbols of the same truth, that freedom, when mobilized, when organized, when turned into industrial action, is the most powerful force in the world. Eugene Fletcher understood this, in his quiet, inarticulate way. Understood it when he banked low over the Texas panhandle at dawn, engine coughing, pesticide streaming from the wings. Understood it when he flew Cotton Queen through flak and fire, holding the formation, trusting his crew, doing the job. The sky, in the end, belongs to those who are willing to fly, not to the aristocrats or the warriors or the aces, but to the workers, the men who know machines, the men who are not afraid of the wind. The crop dusters became bomber commanders because America needed them, and when the need was greatest, they answered, they flew, and they won, and the world changed.